There is, I would argue, in the cultural air that we breathe, there is something happening in our country, really in the world, that is very much like this poisonous gas called carbon monoxide. I want to begin with a question, and here it is. What would you say is the greatest danger we face as a nation? Now, I'm guessing a lot of people are probably thinking, well, it would have to be Islamic extremism and the whole problem with ISIS and Al-Qaeda, etc. And of course, it goes without saying that is a serious issue that is there. But I would argue that's not the greatest danger we face as a nation. In a word, the greatest danger is this. It's called secularism. Secularism. Secularism is essentially life to the exclusion of God. This means in the mindset of someone who is a secularist, they would say there is no final truth. There is no truth that is absolutely true. That is for everyone, everywhere, and in every place. The secularists will say there is no final truth that governs man individually or that governs society corporately. What I find amazing is how this thinking is thought to be a good thing by many, and in some circles it's said to be the best thing that could possibly happen to us in our day. And these people will argue the idea that fixed truth and explicitly defined morality has literally crushed the lives of people for centuries and has held them back and held them down from progression. I seem to recall in Genesis chapter 3 that experience where Adam and Eve are being manipulated by the snake, Satan, the adversary. And do you recall what it was that convinced them to cross the line God had drawn? What it was this. The adversary convinced Adam and Eve that God, by his prohibition, was keeping them down. That his rules were holding them back. And if they would just cross this line and do what he said not to do, their life would come alive and they would know things much better than they do. And reality would open up for them. I mean, that's the kind of thinking that brought down Adam and Eve in the historic fall. Here's a good illustration of what I'm talking about. This is from a leader in the secularistic point of view. He's talking about achieving authenticity. Notice this paragraph. He writes, "For years, our spirits have been suffocated by restrictive traditions and morality." Restrictive. But now we must have the courage to follow our own light. We must resist anyone or anything that stands in our way. We must discover the hero inside ourselves and enter into the freedom that comes when we become who we really are. It's interesting to me, who is the hero in this story? Who is the hero in this mindset? It isn't God, it's me. It's me. My question, however, is, does freedom follow this type of thinking? Or what about this question? If you rule God out of life, is it possible to find lasting happiness, real freedom, and purpose in life? Is it possible if you rule God out of life? I bring this up because it seems to me that this is actually what our nation right now is trying to discover. Can we live without God? As God is more and more pushed out to the margins of everyday living and life. Can we as a people live without God and that influence? By the way, in my view, this explains precisely the division that is presently in our country today. I've been alive a long time, and I can tell you I have never seen the division as more profoundly obvious than it is right now. And here's an explanation of the division. On one side, you have people like us. We believe in the Bible. We believe that God has revealed himself in Christ and that God has spoken. We believe in tradition and traditional morality. We believe in patriotism. We believe in nationalism. We believe in those good things. On the other hand, there are people over here who are of the secular mindset. Now, a lot of people who are of that mindset, they haven't really thought it through. They are of that mindset because they grew up in a culture, and just by being a part of the culture, they have absorbed this manner of thinking. They use the same words that we use. They use terms like humility, tolerance, words like values and convictions. But let me tell you, they don't pour the same meaning into those words that you and I do. This is why there is such division between the two political parties. Now, I'm going to make a few statements here about political parties, so please don't get up and walk out and don't get crazy. I'm just trying to illuminate what's going on in the culture. We have these two major parties, and they both have platforms by which they presumably commit themselves to govern the country. The reason Bible-believing Christians end up leaning more to the Republican agenda, it isn't because of Republicans. Who cares about Republicans? I don't. I'm a registered independent. I'm not into parties. But the reason I end up voting most of the time Republican is because of their platform. They lean in that direction of what I believe. You give me a Democrat who believes what I believe, and I'll vote for him any day of the week. Title, brand has nothing to do with my thinking. On the other hand, you have people over here, and if you look at the platform of the other political party, there's no mention of truth. There's no mention of God revealing himself. In fact, if you remember from 4+ years ago, they tried to extract the idea of God from the document. It is purely secularistic. Now, I realize that's just the platform, and not everyone governs exactly like the platform. But I'm just trying to illustrate the difference. On one side, you have people of tradition like us who believe in God, who believe God has spoken, and then over here you have people who are of this secularistic mindset, and there's a standoff. And it's almost like the country is divided down the middle between these two points of view. The division is deep. The division is serious. But here's my question again. If you rule God out of life? Is it possible to find lasting happiness, freedom, and purpose in life? I bring this question up because this is really the great question the book of Ecclesiastes is designed to answer. If you rule God out of life, what happens? What happens? That's what this book is about. Now, for the record, the writer here is Israel's King Solomon, the son of David and Bathsheba. And the way he writes in this book is this. He takes the position that there is no God and that the only thing real in this life is what you can see with your own eyes. That's his presupposition. As he begins his investigation, that's his presupposition. And then from this perspective, he will then try to find lasting meaning, purpose, and happiness in life, all on his own terms, all based on his own human efforts and wisdom. We would say Solomon has taken on the secularist mindset. Solomon has committed himself to the secularistic point of view. That's his worldview. He's embracing that. And again, I have to tell you something, and I want to be pushy here, if I may. This is the cultural air we breathe right now, secularism. It fills the air culturally. The idea that God is, if he is there, he's irrelevant to life. He's pushed out to the margins. He's not really included in how we live. And so in this culture, when you look and read or read books or watch media, you'll never, ever get away from that point of view. It's all secularism. Have you noticed in the things that come on TV, there's never someone like you, a Christian, who loves God and is an honorable person and who really tries to look out for people. If they are presented in any way, they're always some boob, some goofy person who wants to bully people, or someone who has horrible breath and, just an awkward social misfit. This is permeating the culture. This is why it's so imperative for you parents and grandparents to teach your children. If you don't do it, by the time they turn 21 years of age, they will be a committed secularist. Not because they want to be, but the process, the culture will mold them and shape them into becoming that kind of person. It's different today than it was in the 50s, 60s, 70s, even the 80s. It's different. We have never been here in history. There has never been a civilization, there has never been a nation that tried to live out their experience of life based on secularism. Never. And look at what is happening. And it's, believe me, it's only begun. Now, back to my question. If you rule God out of life, if you live your life in the secularist way, on your terms, what's going to happen? That's what Solomon is going to discover, and that's what the book of Ecclesiastes is all about. By the way, it's interesting, he's going to tell us right up front the conclusion that he came to, and then he will write the rest of the book telling us how he arrived at this conclusion. For example, look at verse 1. He writes, "These are the words of the teacher, King David's son, who ruled in Jerusalem." Now, first of all, the word teacher here in the Hebrew, this is a word for a person who searches things out. This is someone who gathers information and searches things out. That's why in some of the translations they actually use the word searcher here in place of the word teacher. And again, that's what he is doing in this book. And so verse 2, he tells us what is his conclusion. Are you ready for this? Here's his conclusion. Everything is meaningless, says the teacher, the searcher. Completely meaningless. Have a good day. Everything, he says, is meaningless. Now, the word meaningless here comes from a word that is translated vanity in other places and in other Bible translations. But it doesn't mean the kind of vanity that we often see when people are stuck on themselves. Remember the Carole King song, "You're So Vain, You Probably Think This Song Is About You." Well, that's not the kind of vanity that we're talking about here. This word literally means, the word meaningless or vanity, it means pointless. It's going nowhere. There's no point. It's weightless. It's without substance. It's futile. It brings exasperation. And it's empty. Actually, if you go outside on a very cold winter's day and you breathe into the air and you can see the vapor that is there and then gone, that's the word that is being used here for meaningless or vanity. That's the idea. And it reminds me of James 4:14 when he said, "Why, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are like a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes." And so my point then is this. When Solomon uses this word and says that all is meaningless, his point is simply this. When the curtain of life comes down, when everything is finished for you, when it's all over, then everything about you is going to come to absolutely nothing. It's kind of a Dr. Kevorkian view of life. You remember him? Or really a Gloria Steinem view of life. Now, verse 3, he raises this important question that is actually rhetorical. He says, what do people get for all their hard work under the sun? Under the sun. Now, I've underlined that, as you can see, and darkened it, because this word, this phrase, is used 27 times in this book. And so it's needless to say, very, very important. The reason it's important is because it sets the boundaries and the parameters for Solomon's investigation into life. Under the sun means in light of what we can see, or in light of the visible things of this life, the empirical world, what we see, touch, taste, hear, smell, the world that we are able to perceive through our senses. That's what this phrase means. This is life as the world sees it in the secularistic point of view. Ray Stedman writes about this. Look at this. He says the key phrase which gives the context for all that follows in Ecclesiastes is the repeated word under the sun. In these words, we have a description of what life is like if the heavens are shut off from man. If a bowl were placed over the earth, masking the heavens, i.e. the spiritual world from which God speaks and acts, what then would life be like? Given this perspective, what would be the view from earth? This is the experiment of Ecclesiastes. Everything is viewed as being under the sun. No revelation from heaven comes into the picture, meaning God has not spoken, there is no Bible. That's his perspective. There is no revelation, there is no Bible. That's his assumption and his presupposition. And so, in verse 3, again, from this perspective, he raises the question, what do people get for all their hard work under the sun? And by the way, the answer here is implied. This is actually a rhetorical question. What do you get? You get nothing. Verse 4, look at this. He begins now to explain how he has come to this place in his thinking. He writes, generations come and generations go, but the earth never changes. The sun rises and the sun sets, then hurries around to rise again. In other words, his point is life is cyclical. Man lives a linear life, but the truth is life is cyclical in nature. It's filled with endless cycles of life, along with a lot of boring repetition. Generations come, generations go. People come, people go. Presidents come, presidents go. Pastors come, pastors go. I mean, cycles of life. And then look at verse 6. He says, the wind blows south and then turns to the north. Around and around it goes, blowing in circles. This is a picture of life. It just cannot be understood. It cannot be nailed down or figured out. By the way, the men who really understand and work in the Hebrew language, I read there, at least some of them talk about this, and they say that what Solomon is actually writing about here also are the jet streams. The jet streams, the wind currents. We see them today because we have those satellite photography, and we can see it from outer space. How did he know this? How did he understand this? Of course, there's a lot of things that are very scientific in Scripture that were never understood until they were discovered by man. But the point is, the man of Scripture is way ahead always of the man of science. It's not that science isn't important, it's just that the man of the Word of God is way ahead of the person of science. Now, look at this in verse 7. He says, rivers run into the sea, but the sea is never full. Wait a minute, let me get it up for you. Rivers run into the sea, but the sea is never full. Then the water, this is that evaporation process, then the water returns again to the rivers and flows out again to the sea. And so he's just talking about these endless cycles of life on this planet. This is Solomon's perspective of life under the sun, cycle after cycle after cycle. And it's pretty clear he wants us to see, as he does, that this cyclical movement of our life is simply the way things are. Life is not linear, it's cyclical. And so in that light, back to verse 3 in the question, what do people get for all their hard work under the sun? What he's trying to do here is to get us to think about the end result. And in the end, under the sun, living apart from God, you end up with nothing. Men come, men go. Women come, women go. But the system continues ahead. It grinds on day after day after day. That's the way it looks without God. Now, verse 8, he says this, because of the way things are, everything is wearisome. Everything is wearisome. This word wearisome comes from a word that conveys the idea of unsettled, of restlessness or never content, wearisome. And so this, he says, is the truth about people as it's the truth about men and women as they live life within these endless cycles. He has observed that they never seem to achieve lasting contentment. And of course, again, this is especially true when there is no awareness of God and His presence, when people live their lives as if God has not spoken. It's like in the paragraph I gave you a couple of moments ago, Ray Stedman said to us, imagine life with imagine the earth with a bowl over it, and that bowl cuts us off from God and His presence. And Solomon is saying, in that kind of environment, he, as a searcher, wasn't able to find anything that would provide him with lasting contentment, meaning, and purpose in life. I like this paragraph by Dr. Mark Adams. He says, we were made to have something at the center of our life. If people don't have God at the center of their life, they will put something else there. They will end up being addicted to money or sports or having fun or work. They are trying to fill their life with meaning. People today frantically try to find meaning for their life, but inside they know that it doesn't work. This is the great fallacy of humanism. Now stick with me here. Three of the greatest minds in Western civilization were Marx, Freud, and Darwin. And all three of them said the same thing. They all said, you came from nothing and you're going to nothing. We all came from this primal ooze, and you're just some evolutionary blob. You weren't created, you are a cosmic accident. Now, look at this next line. The humanist then comes along and says, this is his message, you came from nowhere, you're going nowhere, but while you're here on earth, your life has meaning and value and dignity. And I wonder, can't you see the absurdity? I mean, the utter absurdity of that thinking. It's so intellectually dishonest. You're taught that your life is a mere accident. You're not going anywhere. Your life is blocked in by your birth and your death, and that's all you have. Oh, but you have a lot of meaning, and your life has a lot of dignity and value. In my view, folks, and I think you would agree with me on this, if there is no God, if there is no eternity, if God has not spoken, if there is no divine accountability, then at least have the guts to say nothing really matters. Because that's the bottom line. You take God out of the picture and nothing matters. How I treat you doesn't matter. Who does it matter to? How you treat me doesn't matter to you. What I do with my morality, it doesn't matter. There is no morality. How do you want to live in a world like that? Now, look again at verse 8. Stay with me if you would. He says, everything is wearisome. And then he adds two words beyond description, or he's talking about beyond the ability to be able to describe. I really spent some time researching this statement so that I could understand it. It is a little difficult, I admit. Look, if you would, at the King James and New American Standard translation of this statement. King James says, all things are full of labor. Man cannot express it. The New American Standard, which is usually the version we use here, today I'm just using the New Living Translation because it's so easy to read, but in the New ASV, which is closer to the Greek than any other translation, notice it. All things are wearisome. And then these words, man is not able to tell it. I would translate it this way, man is not able to admit it. You see, it's not because he can't tell it, it's not because he can't admit it, he won't. His ego won't let him. His pride will not allow him to admit that things really are as they are. He won't go that far. Now, in verse 8b, let me get back to this. He continues with more observations. He says, though man is not willing to admit this, here's the reality, here's the truth about the way things are. No matter how much we see, we are never satisfied. No matter how much we hear, we are not content. Human desire, he would say, is unsatisfiable. And even when you think, and you might be here today thinking to yourself, well, I feel pretty good. I'm satisfied with my life. All right. Hang on. There's a week ahead. Because this horse is going to buck. I can assure you. Lasting contentment, lasting satisfaction. Solomon is saying, we cannot satisfy human desire. Verse 9 is another observation. History, he says, merely repeats itself. It has all been done before. Nothing under the sun is truly new. Now, he's not talking about technology here. He's talking about man and behavior and the way people are. Sometimes people say, here is something new, but actually it is old. Nothing is ever truly new. We don't remember what happened in the past, and in future generations, no one will remember what we are doing now. And so this is Solomon's life under the sun. It's going absolutely nowhere. What he's saying is life is filled with a lot of endless repetition. We get up in the morning, we go to work, we come home from work, we eat, we rest, we sleep. We get up, we go through the same cycle. We get up, and life is just a continuation of this cycling of life. Now, in verse 12, in order to substantiate and nail down all of his findings and his conclusions, from verse 12 onward, Solomon will tell us how he tried to find meaning and purpose in life in three particular areas where people today are giving themselves completely and fully, spending themselves without any hesitation. First of all, he tries to find this meaning and happiness and purpose in the area of human wisdom, or in the area of intellectual pursuits. The idea of gaining knowledge of the world and gaining knowledge of things. He goes highbrow, I would say, and he becomes this intellectual. And remember, he had an advantage because God gave him that wonderful gift. So he's really pouring himself over the things of this life, trying to understand how they work, what they are, etc. And then after he tries this, he gives himself over to a hedonistic way of life, which means he lives his life day in and day out for the achievement of unbridled pleasure. If it feels good, do it. If there's anything that makes you feel happy or good, give yourself to it totally. He lives by that philosophy. He lives by the playboy mentality. Remember something, this guy had 700 wives and 300 concubines. I mean, he just gave himself over to unbridled pleasure. And then after this, he tried materialism. And for Solomon, that was the idea of amassing and owning and acquiring and building amazing things. I was reading just this, actually it was yesterday, in 1 Kings from chapter 1 through to about chapter 8, talks about all of the amazing things that he built. I mean, just phenomenal buildings, phenomenal architecture. That's what he gave himself to, the amassing of things and building things. And then the point is, he had it all, folks, and he tried it all. If you were to take Solomon's life, and if you were to roll Hugh Hefner, Bill Gates, and Albert Einstein into one person, you're getting close to what Solomon was like. Look at what he says. I, the teacher, was king of Israel, and I lived in Jerusalem. I devoted myself to search for understanding and to explore by wisdom everything being done under heaven. I soon discovered that God has dealt a tragic existence to the human race. By the way, that phrase, human race, literally means people of the fall, or humankind of the fall, men of the fall. That, I think, is clarifying. In verse 14, I observed everything going on under the sun, and really, it is all meaningless like chasing the wind. What a picture that is. What is wrong cannot be made right. What is missing cannot be recovered. Now, I'll tell you what I think he means by verse 15. I think what he's saying there is this. Without God in your life, there's really no basis for anything of lasting change. What's wrong cannot be made right. The King James translates that this way: what is crooked cannot be straightened out. In other words, we're all bound up in time and space, and if God is not available to us, there's no way we can bring about lasting change in our life. And so he concludes verse 16. I said to myself, look, I am wiser than any of the kings who ruled in Jerusalem before me. I have greater wisdom and knowledge than any of them. God gave him that special gift. Verse 17, so I set out to learn everything from wisdom to madness and folly. But I learned firsthand that pursuing all this is like chasing the wind. The greater my wisdom, the greater my grief. The greater my wisdom, the greater my grief. To increase knowledge only increases sorrow. That's true. Remember, that's looking at life without God. And if you have no God, to increase in wisdom is only to increase grief. To increase knowledge is only to increase your sorrow about the way things really are. Now, let me summarize and I'm done. 4 things. Number 1 is this. Solomon is telling us that life under the sun is without meaning because there is never any real progress. There is never any real progress. Now, of course, there is a lot of motion, right? Everything that goes around is going to eventually come around, so there is motion. Ecclesiastes 1:3, remember what he said? What do people get for all their hard work under the sun? They don't get anything. It's a rhetorical question. Look at this. By Mark Driscoll, he writes something helpful. We all have lives filled with activity and hurry and worry and busyness. We work hard our whole life. The question is why? What does it gain us? At the end we die, they paint us up like a circus clown. They put us in a box, and they put us in the ground, and whatever we had, somebody else enjoys. We didn't get to enjoy it because we were too busy working for it. What is the point? And he's right. That's what life looks like without God. Number 2, look at this. Under the sun, all the pursuits of men and women will ultimately end without their achieving a lasting sense of satisfaction. Apart from God, everything that gives you happiness and joy in this life is just like cotton candy. It tastes good in the moment, but there's nothing there of substance to bring nourishment to your life. It's like reaching out and taking hold of cobwebs. Look at number 3. Life under the sun will always end up being very frustrating because we are simply unable to fix ourselves in a lasting way. I look at my own life. Before I became a Christian, I couldn't say no and make it stick. Couldn't. I tried and tried and tried to correct things in my life, to break off habits, but I couldn't say no. That's what he's talking about here. There's no way to make the crooked straight if there is no God to look to. And here's my last thought. After all of this, the good news is that God is there. He's very real. Francis Schaeffer had a book, He is there and He is not silent. He's very real, and His Son, Jesus, the Messiah, is the one greater than Solomon, and He alone answers all the great needs of mankind's life. Jesus said in Matthew 12:42 of Himself, He said, indeed, a greater than Solomon is here. And what happens as a result of His coming? I close with this. Solomon writes that he understood the human condition, but he could not fix it. 900 years after Solomon comes Jesus Christ. This one who is God comes into creation as one of us, into this broken, frustrating, fallen, bent, collapsed web of life. he comes into it. He's tempted in every way as we are, yet without sin. Everything Solomon pursued, Jesus was tempted by, but resisted. Solomon knew the problems of life, but he couldn't fix them. He knew the world was filled with sin, but he couldn't forgive. He couldn't cleanse the stain of sin. He knew that people were crooked, but he couldn't straighten them out. He knew the world didn't have what it takes to be the kind of place that was declared good by God, but Jesus did. Jesus came to right everything Adam wronged and to answer all the frustrations Solomon articulated. The creation that collapsed in its web is now being untangled by Jesus and reconnected to the Father, because life has no meaning, life has no purpose unless Creator and creation are reconciled. Every philosophy and every religion and every morality and every movement is really an attempt to bridge the gap between man and God, but there is no hope if God is left out. And then finally, he says Jesus was greater than Solomon because he was God. He came not just to inform us, but to transform us. Not just to share in our sorrow and grief and suffering, but to die for our sin and rise in conquest over it. He conquered our enemies of Satan, sin, and death, and he began the great reclamation project of connecting everything back to the Father. May the 23rd, 1972, was the day that I was connected back to the Father. I was born again, pulled in, adopted as a son of God, a part of his royal family, reconnected to the Father. God now calls me, as he calls you, who have been reconnected to the Father. He calls us to live our lives on the basis of truth. Not this secularistic carbon monoxide that fills the air of this culture. There's a poison in the air, folks. Don't let your children breathe it in. There's a poison that's in the air that will take your children down and destroy their lives. This is the most serious thing that we are facing in our culture today. It's more serious than the ISIS problem. Although that's serious, it's not as serious as this. The cultural air that is everywhere around us is the idea that either God isn't there or he's completely irrelevant to your life. You live as you think, as you choose, etc., etc. And if you live that way, you will lose everything, because that lifestyle is completely meaningless. It's pointless. It takes you nowhere. Let's stand together.